The next topic is cannabis and alcohol. This is a very important topic to me because from my own personal experience, I've had a lot of success in looking at cannabis in low doses as a substitute effect for alcohol. Now, a lot of people don't really recognize the history of cannabis as medicine in the United States. So indulge me with a little brief history lesson here. So if we go in the time machine and go back to the 1850s, and we were looking at the US Pharmacopoeia, which was essentially the formulary for all the drugs that physicians could call upon in their toolbox, if you will, in terms of treating medical patients back in the 1850s. Cannabis was listed in the US Pharmacopoeia as a treatment for alcoholism. So I think that's really interesting data point in consideration for looking at cannabis and really as we were talking about here, looking for the medical indications associated with cannabis. Now, I'm not a physician and I'm not going to get into detail here about treating alcoholism with cannabis. That's really something that should be discussed between you and your physician. But what I would like to talk about is the data that supports the substitution effect of cannabis as a replacement to alcohol. So there's a company called Ease. It's a popular delivery service on the West Coast, and every year they do a survey of their users. And the survey that they published in 2018 showed some dramatic results. They surveyed approximately 5,000 people within their database, and over 60% of those individuals who were surveyed reported that by using cannabis, there was a reduction in their alcohol consumption. I think there's also substantial results showing that approximately 8 to 10% reported that they had entirely eliminated their alcohol consumption and were using cannabis instead. So you might be thinking to yourself, well, wait a minute, no, I actually like alcohol. I'm not an alcoholic. I enjoy, going out with my friends for happy hour. Believe me, I can relate. So I was one of these stressful executives, coming home after the end of the day, coordinating happy hours, drinking wine. I love to go wine tasting, and I still consume alcohol. However, there is a lot of data to suggest that alcohol, there's no really safe level of alcohol consumption. So that's just a really important data point for anybody drinking alcohol to be, considering. In terms of cannabis, what's really powerful about cannabis is that it's a natural intoxicant and it's also a natural sleep aid. So, you don't have to go and look at the research around alcohol and thinking about, is there a safe level of alcohol consumption? You can probably just think back to a recent time you were out and you had a drink, and the next morning you didn't feel that good. You were probably a little groggy. You might have noticed if you had more than one drink, you might have noticed that between 3 and 4 a.m. you were wide awake. That's because that's when your liver was saying, I'm done with alcohol, and woke you up because there was actually that alcohol was being metabolized by your liver, and your body's kind of all out of whack. So if you were to start to look at cannabis, particularly in low doses, as a substitution effect, there's really kind of a halo in the sense that it is a natural intoxicant, and it is also, as I mentioned previously, it is a natural sleep aid. So in terms of short-term effects, you're going to feel relaxed, and just like you would with a glass of wine, and you're also going to sleep better. Now, in terms of long-term effects, you can also look at different research that's been published. Alcohol, having brain issues, memory impairment. You can overdose on alcohol. It's very, very easy to go from a safe dose of alcohol to a lethal dose of alcohol. You've probably heard these stories in the news of just, somebody just saying, being at a fraternity party and overindulging and unfortunately having a lethal consequence. One of the great things about cannabis is that it's actually impossible to consume a lethal dose of cannabis. And this is because of the way that the receptors in the endocannabinoid system are interacting with our body. There's actually not a good concentration of receptors in our brainstem, which means that even if you were to overconsume cannabis, there's not enough to actually shut down your respiration, right? There's not enough to shut down your circulatory system. And that's why there's never been, not anywhere in the world, one case of lethal overdose reported that can be attributed to cannabis worldwide. So that's pretty powerful. There's also the cost associated with alcohol consumption. So even a very modest, drinking, not even modest, even a light drinking habit. Maybe you have a glass of wine or, a cocktail at dinner once or twice a week, looking at $20 a week for your alcohol consumption. Again, that would be a very, very modest level of alcohol consumption. Now you can get low doses of cannabis for as low as 25 cents a dose, and that could easily be a replacement. There's a cost benefit besides the health benefit of looking at cannabis as a substitution from a substitution perspective. Last but not least, there's also the addiction profile. Now, I haven't talked a lot about that. I kind of saved that for this alcohol discussion because there is a risk of addiction with cannabis, particularly in the context of THC. Those rates are very, very low. It's about 9% risk of addiction, and that's kind of comparable to the level of addiction that you might have with caffeine, right? So if you're looking at other controlled substances, opioids, for example, much higher rate of addiction, alcohol, 15% rate of addiction, and also severe withdrawal symptoms when you're trying to extract yourself from an alcohol addiction. Even say looking at tobacco addiction rates as high as 35%. So in terms of the addiction profile of cannabis, there is a risk of addiction, but cannabis is very, very, in terms of the risk profile, cannabis is relatively low risk in terms of that addiction, risk. So that's a very important consideration when you're looking at cannabis as a substitute for alcohol.